My name is Constance Guardi. I'm usually called Connie. And I moved to Riverside in 1979 and have lived here since then. So if I do the math, I got married in 1978 and we were looking for a house. And we started out in Oak Park and didn't find a house there that we liked, and our real estate agent brought us here, but my husband had an aunt who lived in Riverside. Otherwise, I have to say I was totally ignorant of it as a place or as a historic place.
It's easy to miss.
Yeah, well, I lived on the northwest side of Chicago. The furthest I probably ventured into the suburbs when I was a kid, because I didn't have a car, until I was in my 20s, was probably Oak Park. So I never got as far south, even though I don't consider Riverside very far south. I never got as far south as Riverside. I never got as far west probably as LaGrange. So, being raised on the northwest side of Chicago, I was a commuter. I used the public transportation system, and it didn't come to Riverside unless you really went downtown or somehow. So I never did. But when we came and saw it, when the real estate agent brought it, I was immediately taken by the looks. I thought, well, if I have to live in a suburb, being a city girl, it seemed like it was going to be oppressive for me to live in a suburb. I wanted to live in what looked like it was a beautiful suburb. And although when we bought the house, we didn't really tour Riverside that much, but shortly after moving in, we really began to acquaint ourselves with it, and it was just so beautiful and so lovely. And we moved in fall, and it was a gorgeous fall, as it usually is here in Riverside, and walking along, being able to walk along a river, in a few blocks away from our house, and being able to feel like I literally was in a forest when I'm walking in the First Division, and then the beautiful Long Common. So very soon after we moved here, somehow I got in touch, I met someone who was giving tours of Riverside, and they asked me if I wanted to train to give tours of Riverside. A docent. And that was for the Frederick Law Olmsted Society. So I said yes, and I started in the early 1980s giving tours of Riverside, which I continue to do to this day. I'm still a tour guide both for the museum and for the Olmsted Society. Well, when you see them and they show part of the surrounding area, like Berwyn or Forest Park, which will show on it, or North Riverside, and aerial, you'll see all this green. If, of course, it's done when the trees are leafed out, and it'll all be green in Riverside. You won't even really see the curving streets very well because the leafage obscures it. So it really does look like forest when you look at it. And then, of course, with as much forest preserve as we have around our village, that adds to it too. So it really is a beautiful green spot. Well, on a personal basis, my son was born here, so that was a highlight of our life. And probably, I don't know, I guess the best thing that really happened to us was that we came to live in Riverside. And we stayed because we really loved it. We thought we would change houses after, we bought a smaller house. We thought we'd move in 5 years, and instead we put an addition on it and stayed. We did what a lot of Riversiders do. So we've really been quite content and happy. Well, I guess because of my connections with the Olmsted Society and giving tours of Riverside, it's always been so gratifying for me to see how really excited people get about coming here and visiting, and the visitors that we get from different parts of the world who have heard of Riverside. I guess one of the disappointments for me about a lot of people who come to Riverside is they don't bother to learn the history of their own town sometimes, and so people from out of town know more about their history than the people who live here. But the Olmsted tours and tours generally of the village, I think, help to get people acquainted with its wonderful history. For 3 years I was president of the Olmsted Society, but I've been a board member since the 80s. And I continue to be on the board of directors now. Right now, I'm the head of the library committee for it. And that is maintaining the collection of books that the Olmsted Society has gathered since Michael Higgins, who started Higgins Glass,
yes,
who was an important member of the board of directors. He was a rare book collector, and he was very, very much an Olmstedian scholar. And so he and a librarian who was on the board, Francis Winter, also contributed to collecting books. And then in the 1980s, the Olmsted Society and the library reached an agreement, and the collection went to the library. And it's maintained by the library, but it is supported by the Olmsted Society, and I have to chair that committee now. But as far as this place that we're sitting in, this adorable little museum of ours, I became a commissioner in 2008, and just 2 years ago I became the chair of the commission. The exhibit that's on the walls, you can see a little of it behind me, came from the book that we did, Lonnie Secchi and I did, called Riverside for Arcadia Publishers. I think I had spoken with you, and you had said you had seen those Arcadia books before. And when I came on the commission, we did a strategic plan for the commission, and one of the items on the strategic plan was to have an Arcadia book of Riverside. Now that was back in 2008, and about 2011 it hadn't been done, and so I took it upon myself to write the application to see if Arcadia was interested in our town and whatever. And I recruited a very good historian of Riverside, Lonnie Secchi, to come on board with the project. So the two of us undertook it. And I sent in the application, and they accepted it. And then he and I spent, almost a year working on the book. Basically pictorial history, not just a written history. So that you have to have the photos to support your story. And we had lots of photos in here, historic photos. And we got a lot of cooperation from the village and from the police department, fire department, the school. RB gave us access to their archives for photos, and we were able to get a lot of different photos, but most of them were all in our collection. So behind the doors, these are doors, all of our photos and all of our objects that are archived are here. And so Lonnie and I spent a lot of time going through all of that. We went through all the local history files that are back here in the library, what the village had, what Public Works had. We went through all of those things, and I'd say that Lonnie did the heavy lifting on the writing, but as far as getting it all together, it was a combined effort on our parts. And then we had some help. Another one of the commissioners helped me with the scanning and getting the things. Kim Jacobs, she helped me get those things to Arcadia Publishers. But it is a formula book. Every one of the Arcadia books is 128 pages long. So you can't go rambling on. You're limited by the number of words that you can have, and you're limited to the number of pictures that you can have.
Okay.
So, and then they edit you. So you can't put in too many jokes because they edit those right out. Any of those little local colloquial things get kind of edited out of there. So that it becomes a very nice, if you look at the book, if you've seen it, there are, explanations under all of the photos of what they show and how they relate to the history of Riverside.
The little jokes about who was the fellow that was maybe the town drunk, possibly, but
Otto Peterson. Yeah.
Just the local color is terrific.
Yeah, they let us do some of that.
That's nice.
Charlie Lang is in there, you know, the bicycle policeman who used to put the kids in the calaboose. And, you know, there is some real cute local
And where was
color.
that calaboose building? That was out
That was on Blooming Bank.
That was on
It's
Blooming
gone.
Bank. Yeah.
It's gone. It looked a lot like the building that's over here on Pine, next to the fire department.
Oh, yeah.
That round building, if you look at, well, actually, there's a picture on the wall of it right there.
The parking lot?
Over there, see the, yeah, it was a round building like that. So,
And there was an odd thing.
before my time, I have to say. Robert Heinrich, he was the man who started the Olmsted Society. He was the first president of the Olmsted Society. He was what do I want to say? I don't want to say he was a curmudgeon exactly, but he was somebody who didn't exactly get along with the local government at the time, and he lived on Long Common, and he was very, very much an Olmstedian scholar, and very much, by the way, he called it the village in the park as opposed to the village in the forest, which in some ways is probably a bit more descriptive. The first division is more a village in the forest, but the whole village is very park-like in its looks. So I don't think he was completely wrong by saying village in the park for him, but they say village in the forest, that's fine.
We'll stick with that.
We'll stick with it. But he actually did all the work to get the Department of the Interior to name Riverside as a landmark. And then a couple years later, the village government got on board and sanctioned it, so to speak. But he had worked through the Riverside Township because you did need some kind of governmental body to support him, and he did work through that. But either way, it was done in 1970. And right outside the museum is the rock with the plaque that commemorates that landmark status. And it is an ongoing process. I mean, having gotten landmark status, again in 1985, the Department of the Interior required us to have a survey of all the structures in Riverside, so that within our files, each structure has a form that was done in 1985 regarding the landmark status, whether it contributed to it or whether it didn't. You know, there was an excellent and contributing that was done, and it wasn't done by anyone here locally. Someone was brought in to do it. Yeah, that was done for the national landmark status. Those little ovals that you see, the little ovals that you see have to do with local landmarks, and they're in this book.
Okay.
That this actually is sold by the village. This was done under the historic preservation ordinance. And it's when the Preservation Commission came into existence. And the book itself, a very important person in Riverside is Richard Ray. And Richard Ray, who is an architect and who has served on many commissions, including, he's now on the Preservation Commission, but he was a very important member of the Plan Commission before that too. But he did this when the local landmark status came into being, and that was actually 1992, I think was the
you see those
date.
ovals with the
And the ovals, yeah. Riverside Library is one.
Sure, and the big Kuhn Tomek and all the.
Yeah. There's in the back of the book. And there have been some since, and it'll do all the. It has all the numbers that relate to the descriptions in the book.
Own little walking tour.
Well, we do have the commission has done a walking tour of the first division that is available, and it's available on our website as well, of the museum. Well, I studied history. I taught history. I was a high school history teacher for a number of years, and then I became a high school counselor. But I have a master. I taught at Harrison High School to begin with. Yeah, there you go. A couple blocks away from County Jail, Cook County Jail, and then.
Is that Douglas Park?
It's near Douglas Park.
Okay.
It's not right in Douglas Park. Douglas Park is further north in Lawndale.
Okay.
Little Village is the area near Harrison, and then when it closed in '83, I went to Benito Juarez High School, and that's at Cermak and Ashland, where Blue Island is cut off by the school. Yeah. Pilsen, the area that's Pilsen. That many people here in Riverside with Czech backgrounds know Pilsen real well. Of course, today it's becoming a fairly upscale neighborhood these days.
Yeah. Well, even back when I was back in the 80s, there was like artist people lived.
Yes, the East Pilsen did. Yeah.
Pilsen
And it's kind of spreading west these days. It was a nice place to work there. There is a side, and there's a young man taping this who goes to Riverside Brookfield High School, and of course Riverside Brookfield High School for us was quite an adventure when my son went to high school there because of the athletics, and he was a football star, and we had a great deal of fun involved with the activities surrounding his football team and his track team. So we really enjoyed that part of Riverside. I'd say one of the things about Riverside that has changed since I moved here, when I moved here in the late 70s, there weren't a lot of children in Riverside. There weren't a lot of children where we lived on Gage Road. And gradually, the population seemed to really get a lot older when we moved in, and then continued. And then all of a sudden, I'd say in the kind of in the 90s, all of a sudden younger families started moving in, and more children appeared, and all of a sudden the schools that seem to not have too many children are beginning to fill up. And even today, the size of Riverside Brookfield High School has grown even since my son graduated in 2002. I think there were only about 1,100 students then, and now I think there's over 1,600. So that's been quite a change, and I think for the good, that there are more children and that there's more activity. Even the parks and recreation I've seen really grown since when we moved in. Even when my son was a child, there was less going on than there is today. I think the Parks and Recreation offers a lot more programs now than they did then. And it's because there are more kids, and
that's true.
And it's good. Scottswood Common goes back to the encampment of General Winfield Scott, who was going to the Black Hawk Wars. Black Hawk was never here. We do have a street named Black Hawk, but he was never here. But General Winfield Scott and his troops were here. They had been traveled to country that there was a cholera outbreak in his troops. He lost quite a few of his troops. In fact, he was too late for the war as he traveled south. But because he encamped here in 1832, so his name remained. So when Olmsted came here in '68, that area was already called Scottswood. Oh. So that was told to him when he got here. So he retained that when he named the streets. He retained that and called it Scottswood Common, and then named the road Scottswood Road. The best expert on the real production of the bourbon and water, which is what we believe they were drinking that night, when John Baptiste Beaubien was made the captain of the militia, of the Cook County Militia. They had barrels of whiskey, and the story always was that they dumped them in the water. But the man who owns Quincy Street Distillery gives a much better, probably scientific report of how they actually mix the bourbon with the water. But colloquially, because they were drinking and there was the stream, there was the spring, that it got called Bourbon Springs because of that event. But it was really a celebration for the appointment of John Baptiste Beaubien. Yeah. And then in that same area, if you look at the Bourbon Springs Monument that's down there, the third thing that it'll commemorate is Daniel Webster coming here to speak. And he had relatives who lived here actually, and that was part of the reason that he was here. So I mean, there are families in Riverside, when you know the history of Riverside, that no longer have a presence, but there are still descendants of like the Sherman family, the Cross family, so that there's one family in Riverside that claims the 9th generation of Riversiders. So you know, they go for pretty far back. And the president of the Santa Fe Railroad lived here, Ripley. And today, of course, we have one of the big producers from TV that lives here in Riverside, Wirtz. Yeah, Larry Wirtz. So Judy Bart Topinka, you know, we did have a state-wide officer. She was the treasurer and then later comptroller, ran for governor. You know, she had quite a storied history. We have a house that was designed by Calvert Vaux, right across the street from the Riverside Presbyterian Church, that was designed by Vaux, but was built for John Dorr, who was the president of the Board of Education in Riverside at the time. I don't mean Riverside, in Chicago. He was the president of the Board of Education in Chicago, and he was head of the Board of Trade. So, I mean, there've been we've had a lot of physicians and, you know, people professors, I mean, a lot of people with really good professions and with they have made good contributions to the world who have lived in Riverside. I think a lot of them do not realize how some people say it's the first planned community, but it's not really the first planned community in the United States, but it's the first suburban completely planned community that took care of infrastructure that no other suburb of any town in the United States had, so that you've got the gas works and the water works and the streets laid out with gutters and sewers and pipes running to the sewer pipes running all the way to the houses from the street, and water being accessible on the 3rd story of homes in, you know, we're talking 1870. That wasn't anywhere else in the United States, or anywhere really, where you have a complete town like that. And so Riverside is feels much more like a town or a village, and it will be featured in the Channel 11. WTTW is doing the 10 Towns That Changed America, that will air April 19th at 8 o'clock on Channel 11 with Jeffrey Bear narrating it. But I think that people don't realize the significance of the actual founding of this town, and that you know, Childs was basically a real estate speculator. You know, we just got really lucky in this town that he had enough sense to hire a man who became the first real landscape architect in the United States, Frederick Law Olmsted, to design it, so that it is unique and it stays unique through all of it. And I don't know that everybody certainly I didn't know it when I moved here. And I don't know that everybody who lives here really knows that or appreciates it.
Everyone listening to this will now know it. And the preservation of all the Olmstedian tenets about how does that affect the future? Does it limit Riverside? You know what I mean? Is it?
Well, probably the biggest limiting factor is that our central business district, because Olmsted, well, not just Olmsted, but I mean at the time, Olmsted thought he was providing for a central business district with the arcade building. You know, it wasn't called the arcade building then, it was just called the stores. And it had just about everything anybody would need at that time that they could get pretty much from those stores that were there. But the sense of expansion of that business district was not part of the planning in Riverside. And some of our towns, when you come in on the train, the sides of the train, there's no building so that you don't feel like you're coming in through a tunnel or alleyway. For example, Berwyn, when you come in, everything's spread out to the sides.
Yes.
Nothing's right along the railroad tracks, but in Riverside, it's right along the railroad tracks till you get to the center of town. And because those lots were all smaller lots for people of more modest means than the larger lots in Riverside, our business district spread into those areas, but never was well planned, let's say, as a business district. And I think that's one of the things in Riverside that people always kind of bemoan these days. Why isn't there more shopping in Riverside?
Limited space.
Yeah, and why are our taxes so high? Because we're basically a real estate, right, but our taxes really aren't high for what we get, but we don't have the sales tax base that other communities may have.
Or industrial.
Yeah, and no industry. In fact, one time they wanted to put up a factory in Riverside, and the people got really upset. Yeah, well, the swim club went in where it was. Yeah. Well, I think there's a great deal of resilience in Riverside, and largely because of its beauty. I think that when people visit here and they see I might say too, its cleanliness, the fact that they had no alleys, and so that there isn't the utility lines are all away from the street, so that you don't have you still have that sense of being in a more rural place than being in a city, than being in just an urban area. So I mean, almost anywhere where you walk in Riverside, because of the curvilinear streets and the gentleness of the passage through it, as long as you don't get lost. If you can maneuver the changes of the names of the streets here and there and get around. But I think that it is the beauty of it and the design of it will continue to make it a valuable place to live. And so, you know, a lot of people do all their shopping online these days too. So, I mean, retail has its problems everywhere, true, but a few more little shops and I mean, we have nice restaurants in Riverside. I love Molly's and the Choo Choo, and even the ethnic restaurants, the Riverside Restaurant, and the fact that we have you know, kind of a standalone grocery store too, so that we don't have that kind of franchise feeling about our stores or about
Although
anything.
it was a jewel at one point.
It was a jewel. Oh, it was a cute little jewel too. And that's why Jewel had got rid of it, because it was too small.
Yeah. I know that the last version of Henninger's,
A&P.
that was like an A&P and
Yeah, the A&P
jewel,
was the first, and the Jewel, right.
Yeah.
That was back in the 30s, yeah.
Those photos
Yeah.
were terrific.
They were really little stores though.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, when you think about you know, a Jewel now, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot of them around us. We have a lot of shopping around this area. I mean, I think about when they talk about places that are like food deserts. I mean, we're almost buried by all the food that's available to us. I mean, there's so many grocery stores, not right in Riverside, but around us, everywhere, you know. I mean, and you know, that's been a big change too. When I moved to Riverside, like Cermak Plaza and the area right across in North Riverside, they all seem to be going downhill. And now they're like an explosion.
Yes.
Now there we see franchises, lots of franchises,
Yeah.
and Costco's in there, you know, and there's, but
Chick-fil-A.
yeah, not just McDonald's but Chick-fil-A, right? And what's that burger place called? Gourmet Burgers, and I mean, there's just all kinds of things right on the periphery of us. But in a sense, that will help us because we're kind of self-contained away from that, yet we're very close to it. We can get to it if we want it.
And that's part
But
of
it doesn't despoil our landscape. There is a sense of almost sanctity about the village that it doesn't have that kind. We don't really have any busy streets. You know, you think of some of the suburbs that get a lot of, well, you think about Oak Park, it's a huge place, but it's a grid.
Yeah.
And it's got busy streets, you know. And here, without the grid, we don't have those busy streets. I mean, First Avenue and Harlem may border us, but they don't come through us.
No. Should Riverside schools include a section on the history of Riverside, just so that the local children know?
Oh, I think they should. And just recently, I sent to Jeff Miller a notification that we got from the National Association of Olmsted Parks for a curriculum for teaching not just Riverside's children, but it would be so appropriate for Riverside children to like do a hands-on landscape architecture curriculum. It's just a delightful, there's a video that they sent with it of this curriculum in process when they were actually doing it with a third grade class. And Brookline, Massachusetts is yeah, that's Olmsted's home, and it's part of the National Park Service. And so they had a park ranger who was conducting this program. And so there's going to be a July conference to share this kind of curriculum and get schools interested in it. I don't know if we found out about it soon enough, but I'm hoping that you know, maybe a couple years from now, that'll be included within our curriculum in our elementary schools. I think it would be wonderful for our children.
That's great. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time this evening. You were terrific. You're a font of knowledge.
It's like saying you shouldn't talk so much.
It's amazing. It's terrific. I mean, I read the book a few times, but I can't, boy, just to have written this and to go through all the work that you and
Lonnie
did,
that
was, it's quite a piece of work, and you should be very proud.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for including me.